while the world holds its breath waiting for a storm of artillery across the Taiwan Strait. The true masterminds of geopolitical chess are quietly rewriting the boundaries of life and death on a tiny, almost invisible atoll. If you are only watching the front lines and reacting to sensational headlines, you are already a step behind. Today, we tear open the first page of a terrifying strategic playbook that everyone missed: the slow-boiling, cold-blooded reality of the Dongsha Islands. To comprehend the true gravity of what is unfolding, we must strip away the noise of daily news cycles and examine a glaring historical and legal void. Let us travel back to a pivotal moment in global diplomacy. The year is 1979. The United States Congress passes the Taiwan Relations Act. This document is universally heralded as the absolute bedrock of Washington's security architecture in the region. It is the definitive text that dictates the threshold of American military intervention. But if you read the fine print, a chilling reality emerges when explicitly defining the geographical scope of its security commitments. The legislation is coldly precise. It guarantees the defense of the main island and the pescadores. Yet, it conveniently and entirely deliberately omits the outer islands. It leaves Dongsha, Taiping, Kinmen, and Matsu floating in a vast ocean of legal ambiguity. Why was this done? In the drafting rooms of Washington during the late 70s, American policymakers were desperate to leave themselves an emergency exit. They wanted a buffer of strategic ambiguity, a calculated gray area to ensure they would never be automatically dragged into a thermonuclear superpower conflict over a barren, isolated rock. They believed they were engineering a brilliant diplomatic failsafe. Today, that very failsafe has metastasized into a fatal Achilles heel. Let us draw a horizontal comparison to understand the severity of this loophole. Look at how the United States handles the Senkaku Islands with Japan. Successive American administrations have stood at the podium and explicitly, repeatedly affirmed that Article 5 of their Mutual Defense Treaty covers those specific islands. In that scenario, the red line is painted in thick, unmistakable strokes. But around Dongsha, the red line does not exist. It is merely a fading pencil mark, waiting to be erased. The opponent understands this legal architecture perfectly. When unmanned aerial vehicles begin to loiter in this undefined gray zone, when the navigational tracks of 3,000-ton maritime law enforcement vessels grow tighter and denser by the week, this historical blind spot is weaponized. It becomes the sharpest probing blade imaginable. The adversary is not foolish enough to launch a massive kinetic amphibious assault that would instantly trigger a global coalition. Instead, they are slipping through the cracks of a 40-year-old legal document. They are standing at the threshold, holding a magnifying glass to this loophole, and forcing the decision-makers in Washington to face an agonizing dilemma. Are you truly prepared to mobilize your nuclear-powered aircraft carriers? Are you ready to risk the lives of thousands of American sailors over a coral atoll that barely spans 2 square kilometers, lacks its own freshwater supply, and is garrisoned only by a skeletal crew of lightly armed Coast Guard personnel? In the unforgiving calculus of modern geopolitics, a territory's strategic value is never measured by its absolute physical size or the volume of its garrison. It is measured by its capacity to act as a wedge. It is measured by its ability to force a vastly superior opponent into making a paralyzing choice at the most inconvenient possible moment. We must view this geopolitical contest not as a traditional battlefield, but as a surgical operation conducted in complete darkness. Dongsha is the cold steel scalpel, making the very first microscopic incision. You do not feel the agonizing pain immediately, nor do you see the blood, but the localized paralysis is already creeping along the nerve endings toward the central nervous system. Ignore the cut, and the infection silently reaches the bone. Scream in panic over a minor scratch, and you expose your profound fragility to the watching world. To understand how this legal vulnerability is being actively exploited, we must shift our gaze from the archives of Congress to the unforgiving reality of the physical map. Most people glance at the northern edge of the South China Sea, see an isolated speck of coral, and dismiss it as a distant, irrelevant outpost. But true geopolitical predators do not look at surface colors. They look at structural choke points, considered too critical, yet frequently ignored. Geographical metrics. In a straight line, the Dongsha Islands are approximately 260 kilometers from the coastline of Shantou in mainland China. Yet, they sit roughly 450 kilometers away from Kaohsiung in Taiwan. This geographic inversion is not merely a piece of trivia. In any sudden contingency, this massive disparity in distance dictates the brutal mathematics of power projection. It creates an insurmountable chasm in the speed, efficiency, and cost of logistical reinforcement. However, the true lethal gravity of this location lies just to its east. Dongsha stands as the undisputed western sentinel of the Bashi Channel. This stretch of water is far more than one of the most congested arteries for global commercial shipping. It is the premier stealth-enabling underwater corridor connecting the South China Sea to the vast expanse of the Western Pacific. Let US examine the hydrographic data. The waters of the Bashi Channel plunge to depths exceeding 2,000 meters, generating complex thermal layers and unpredictable acoustic shadows. These conditions serve as perfect natural shields for ballistic missile submarines, slipping silently into the open ocean. Whoever establishes a normalized multi-domain presence on Dongsha, whoever manages to install the persistent radar arrays, the electronic warfare nodes, and the deep-sea sonar listening grids, effectively controls the gateway to this corridor. They are essentially installing a one-way mirror over the Pacific Ocean. You must think of this tiny atoll not as a piece of land, but as an unblinking eye and an impossibly sensitive ear extended directly into the abyssal plains. If you manage to alter the dynamic equilibrium here, you are not simply coloring in a new pixel on a regional map. You are securing a physical garrote that can be tightened around the operational freedom of an adversary's naval fleet at will. When a microscopic node like this is quietly weaponized, what collapses next is not just a handful of defensive radar stations. It is the entire psychological architecture of the first island chain. When we speak of an accelerated tempo in this theater, you must completely erase the Hollywood imagery of a massive earth-shattering amphibious landing. In the high-stakes poker game of modern geopolitics, true acceleration is never announced with a declaration of war. It is the geometric multiplication of activities within the gray zone. It is the normalization of a suffocating maritime presence. Today, you might see a seemingly harmless civilian research vessel loitering nearby. Tomorrow, it is an unmanned aerial vehicle flying just a fraction of an inch outside sovereign airspace. The day after, it is a fleet of Coast Guard cutters pushing their operational perimeter slightly closer. Every single maneuver is calculated with terrifying precision. The scale of the provocation is always kept just below the threshold that would force the opponent to flip the table or push the nuclear button. It is the geopolitical equivalent of slicing flesh with a very dull blade. Human biology and psychology are wired to respond to sudden, massive threats with a surge of adrenaline and a clear fight or flight response. But we are entirely unequipped to handle endless, microscopic adjustments. Endless friction does not trigger heroism. It triggers profound fatigue. Once the defending forces become exhausted, once they become numb to the repetitive blips on their radar screens, a completely new and devastating reality has already taken root. We do not need to guess how this strategy ends, because we only need to look at a brutal historical parallel. Consider the Scarborough Shoal standoff in 2012. There were no supersonic missiles fired. There were no naval broadsides. Through the sheer, relentless, normalized presence of maritime law enforcement and fishing vessels, the physical reality of control was completely transferred without a single shot ever being fired. This is the ultimate trap of gray zone warfare. It forces the defender into a paralyzing dilemma. Do you start a catastrophic regional war over a fishing boat, or do you silently surrender the sea? But the psychological torture is only half of the strategy. The financial bleeding is where the true lethality lies. Look at the raw, asymmetric mathematics of this attrition. To counter this relentless low-level pressure around these outer islands, the defending authorities were forced to draw up plans for a massive special budget exceeding $900 million. This absolute fortune was meant for upgrading coastal radars, deploying anti-drone systems, and modifying logistical transport platforms. Yet, this staggering financial demand immediately triggered internal political gridlock and exposed a severe organizational fragility. The brilliance of this open conspiracy is that the opponent only needs to deploy a few low-cost commercial drones and a handful of conventional patrol boats to force the defender to burn through hundreds of millions of dollars just to maintain a constant state of high alert. As long as the opponent holds the conductor's button, dictating the rhythm of the crisis, the defender has already lost half the war. You are forced to run your societal engine at maximum capacity until it overheats, tears itself apart, and is consumed by internal friction. It is exactly like living in an aging, poorly maintained wooden house. You should not be terrified of the roaring tornado outside, because when the storm comes, you know exactly how to hide in the basement. Your true nightmare should be the silent termites nesting deep inside your load-bearing pillars. They do not make a sound. They do not shatter the windows. The exterior paint remains absolutely flawless, but they are consuming your structural integrity piece by piece. Then, one day, you will cough slightly too loud, and the entire house will instantly collapse into a cloud of dust upon your head. That is the gray zone. If the adversary is truly accelerating their operational tempo around this specific vector, their ultimate strategic objective is rarely to just seize a few square kilometers of coral. Instead, they are using this extreme pressure to harvest the three massive structural geopolitical victories. The first victory is utilizing Dongsha as a high-precision political probe. It perfectly tests the actual reaction speed and political resolve of the United States and its regional alliance architecture. In the brutal jungle of geopolitics, the ironclad promises spoken by diplomatic spokespersons are entirely worthless. The only data that possesses true strategic value is what happens in the first 72 hours of a sudden crisis. Who is the first to hesitate? Who begins whispering about appeasement within the alliance? who privately pulls out a calculator to frantically tally the economic costs of intervention. This real-world pressure testing is a priceless asset that no think tank simulation could ever replicate. If Washington displays even a fraction of a millimeter of strategic retreat or hesitation, its security credibility built over decades in the Indo-Pacific will face catastrophic bankruptcy. This is precisely why the most advanced nuclear carrier strike groups look completely powerless against provocations that stay below the threshold of armed conflict. The tool of deterrence is simply too heavy, and the provocation is calibrated to be far too light. The second victory is the complete reconstruction of the psychological safety map of the entire Asia-Pacific. A sense of security is built entirely on blind faith in the status quo. The moment this maritime zone is subconsciously accepted by all parties as a high-risk frontline. The moment everyone defaults to the idea that control here can be gradually diluted, the understanding of boundaries is irreversibly rewritten. Imagine a peaceful village. Suddenly, a pack of wolves appears on the outskirts, patrolling exactly at the same time every single day. Initially, the villagers are terrified, but if the wolves simply step 10 meters closer each day without immediately attacking, the psychological defense line of the villagers will eventually collapse inward. They will begin to accept the presence of the wolves as a natural phenomenon. This psychological surrender is far more absolute than destroying 10,000 concrete bunkers. The third victory is transforming these gray zone operations into a highly polished, combat-ready machine. Through prolonged, low-intensity standoffs, what used to be experimental tactics become deeply institutionalized. It forces different agencies, the Coast Guard, the Navy, maritime militias, and intelligence networks, to synchronize perfectly in a highly complex legal environment. Once this toolkit is proven effective here, it can be copied and pasted across the entire South China Sea. Do not underestimate the macroeconomic devastation this creates. When a critical node like this is squeezed, multinational executives convene emergency midnight meetings to calculate the astronomical costs of rerouting supply chains. Wall Street algorithms ruthlessly reprice the systemic risk of the entire region. Ocean freight insurance premiums skyrocket at an impossible trajectory. Ultimately, it is the average citizen who feels the sting at the grocery store, realizing entirely too late that the cold reality has already shifted beneath their feet. The true master of the board does not aim to capture your most prized piece immediately. He uses the threat to that piece to force you to break your own formation, leaving your entire strategy paralyzed and exhausted. In this sprawling, sticky web, the heavy hammer of a superpower swinging blindly only looks clumsy and completely exhausted. Yet, hearing this cold analysis, many still fall into the trap of empiricism. You might ask, does this mean a massive naval battle of apocalyptic proportions will erupt next month? That is the exact binary thinking that gets nations destroyed. The masses can only process black and white. Either the nuclear button is pressed tomorrow or there will be everlasting peace. But mature analysts do not roll dice to guess. When the powder keg explodes, they watch to see if the underlying structural foundations are experiencing irreversible torsion. History never rewards those who wait for the sirens to sound to understand the world. People believe strategic disasters strike like sudden, earth-shattering earthquakes. But true strategic risk is a rising tide. It starts gently, washing over your feet, taking away a single microscopic grain of sand. You look at the horizon, and the ocean seems perfectly calm. But by the time you realize the water has risen to your chest, crushing your lungs, and you try to turn back, you discover the shore you once stood on has been completely swallowed by the deep. Dongsha is the first wave of that rising tide, quietly pulling the sand from beneath your feet. We are standing on the terrifying edge of a fractured fault line, where the old order is crumbling, and the new rules have yet to be written. Do not be the person who only screams for help when the water is already over your head. If this analysis pierced through the noise and showed you the brutal reality hiding beneath the headlines, make sure to hit the like button. Share this with those around you who are still asleep in the comfort of their daily news feeds. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. In this gray zone chess match, who do you think will expose their fatal flaw first? I am Lin, and I will see you next time as we continue to ruthlessly dissect this rapidly changing world.